In the spring of 1968, the men at the grain elevator in Streeter Junction agreed on one thing. Merle Gustafson had finally lost his mind. They'd say it while leaning against their pickups, watching him load seed from the back of a co-op truck. Not corn seed, soybean seed. Enough to plant 160 acres. He's planting 40% of his ground in beans, someone said, like it was a diagnosis. In Livingston County, another replied, we're corn country. Always have been. Merle heard them. He always heard them. But he didn't turn around. Just kept tallying the bags against his order slip, checking off varieties, Wayne, Hawkeye, Amsoy 71, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. What I'm about to tell you is documented in agricultural records across central Illinois, USDA census data from the late 60s and early 70s, and Extension Service reports that tracked one of the most significant crop shifts in Midwest farming history. While I've woven together details from multiple farms and farmers to create this narrative, every economic trend, every piece of equipment, every variety of soybean, and every agricultural challenge you're about to hear is pulled directly from the historical record. The names have been changed, but the transformation was real. And it started with farmers like Merle who saw what was coming before anyone else did. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what was happening with soybeans in 1968. According to the Illinois Crop Reporting Service, the state had planted about 3 million acres of soybeans that year, which sounds like a lot until you realize Illinois had over 10 million acres of corn. Soybeans were still the junior crop, the experimental crop, the thing you planted on marginal ground or as a rotation afterthought. In Livingston County specifically, the ratio was even more lopsided. Corn dominated everything. The elevator was built for corn. The equipment dealers stocked corn planters and corn heads. The local wisdom, passed down from fathers who'd farmed since the Depression, said corn was king and everything else was a gamble. But Merle Gustafson was reading different reports. He'd been studying the numbers from a University of Illinois Extension office in Urbana. Soybean yields were climbing, from 18 or 20 bushels an acre in the 50s to 25, sometimes 30 bushels in the mid-60s. New varieties were coming out of the agriculture experiment stations every year, each one bred for higher protein content, better disease resistance, and adaptation to central Illinois soils. The prices were holding steady. Between $2.40 and $2.60 a bushel through most of 67 and into 68. That was better margin than corn when you factored in lower input costs. No nitrogen. Simpler weed control if you planned it right. And the crop rotation benefits. Merle had read enough agronomy bulletins to know that corn following soybeans yielded 8 to 12% better than continuous corn. But reading reports in your kitchen and making a decision that puts a third of your income at risk, those are different things entirely. If you farmed in Illinois in the 60s, you probably remember when soybeans went from experimental to everywhere. What year did your family make the switch? Tell me in the comments. Merle farmed 400 acres 3 miles south of Streeter Junction, land his father had bought in 1944 when he came back from the Pacific. Good black dirt, drummer silted clay loam, the kind of soil that would grow anything if you treated it right. The home place had a white 2-story farmhouse, a machine shed that always needed another coat of paint, and a hip-roof barn that Merle's grandfather had built in 1911. Merle's wife, Dorothy, kept chickens and a garden and worked part-time at the school cafeteria in town. They had 3 kids, 2 in high school, 1 in junior high, and a mortgage that was manageable as long as nothing went wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. That was the problem. Merle was 42 years old in the spring of 1968, and he'd been farming the same rotation his father had taught him. Corn, oats and alfalfa seeding, then 3 years of hay. It worked. It kept the soil in decent shape. It paid the bills. But Merle had started to notice things. The corn yields weren't climbing the way they should. He was putting down more nitrogen every year, switching from anhydrous ammonia to a sidedress program, and the response was flattening out. The soil test showed adequate levels, but something wasn't adding up. Meanwhile, the 20 acres of soybeans he'd planted in 66 and 67, just a test, just to see, had performed better than expected. The ground looked better after beans. Darker, more friable when he worked at the next spring. So in February of 1968, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil and a farm journal article titled "The Coming Soybean Expansion," Merle made a decision. He was going to plant 160 acres of beans. That meant taking 120 acres out of corn, 40% of his tillable ground, and betting on a crop that most of his neighbors still considered a novelty. Dorothy looked at the numbers when he showed her. She didn't say much, just nodded and said, "You've thought this through." "I have," Merle said. "Then we'll make it work." That was Dorothy. No drama, no hand-wringing. If Merle said he'd thought it through, that was enough. But the neighbors were a different story. The first person Merle told was Vernon Heikkinen, who farmed a section just west of Merle's place. Vernon ran 600 acres, mostly corn and a few head of beef cattle. They'd known each other since grade school, helped each other harvest, borrowed equipment back and forth. When Merle mentioned the soybean plan over coffee at the Streeter Junction Cafe in March, Vernon set his cup down and stared. 160 acres? Vernon said, "You serious?" "Dead serious." "That's a hell of a gamble, Merle." "I don't think it is," Merle said. "The data supports it. Rotation benefits. Input costs are lower. Market stable." Vernon leaned back. Market stable until it isn't. And beans don't have the yield potential corn does. You're giving up 20, 30 bushel of corn to plant a crop that might give you 25 bushel of beans. Math doesn't work. "It does if you account for nitrogen savings and the yield bump on next year's corn," Merle said. Vernon shook his head. "You've been reading too many university bulletins. Those guys don't farm. They sit in offices and publish papers. Real farming's different." That conversation set the tone. By April, when Merle started field work, word had spread. At the implement dealer in Pontiac, where Merle had gone to look at a used soybean platform for his International Harvester 403 combine, the parts manager made a joke about it. "Heard you're going into the bean business, Gustafson. You opening a tofu factory next." At the grain elevator, the manager pulled Merle aside. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "We don't have a lot of bean storage here. You're going to be hauling to Chenoa or all the way to Fairbury." Even at church, Merle and Dorothy went to Lutheran church in town every Sunday. People had opinions. One of the deacons, a retired farmer named Emil Thorson, cornered Merle after the service. "I farmed 40 years and never planted more than 20 acres of beans at a time," Emil said. "You know why? Because beans are a supplement crop, not a replacement. You're taking a risk you don't need to take." Merle listened, nodded, thanked people for their concern, but he didn't change his mind. The planting started the last week of April. Merle had sold his old corn planter and bought a used John Deere 4-row bean planter from a farmer down in McLean County who decided beans weren't for him. It had been refurbished, new seed plates, fresh paint, and Merle had calibrated in the yard 3 times to make sure the population was right. He was aiming for 10 plants per foot in 30-inch rows, which would give him about 175,000 plants per acre. The extension recommendation said you could get away with less, but Merle figured if he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. He pulled the planter with his Alice Chalmers D19, the same tractor he bought new in 1963. It was rated at 62 horsepower at the PTO, painted Persian orange with cream-colored wheels, and it had a torque converter that made it smooth in the field. Merle kept it maintained like it was a piece of furniture. Oil changed every 50 hours. Grease fittings hit daily. Air filter cleaned weekly during the season. The soil conditions were good that spring. A dry March had let the ground warm up early, and by late April the seed bed was nearly perfect. Firm enough for good seed-to-soil contact, but loose enough to allow emergence. Merle planted the Wayne variety first. 60 acres on the north end of the farm. Then the Hawkeye on the 40 acres adjacent to the road. Then the Amsoy 71 on the 60 acres south of the house. Each variety had slightly different characteristics, maturity dates, height, resistance to certain diseases, and Merle wanted to see which one performed best on his ground. The neighbors watched. Some drove by slowly, looking at the fields. A few stopped to ask questions. Most just shook their heads and kept driving. One afternoon in early May, Merle was cultivating beans, running a rotary hoe to break up crusted soil and kill small weeds, when he saw Vernon's truck parked on the road. Vernon got out and walked the fence. "How's it looking?" Vernon called. Merle throttled down and idled over. "Coming up good. Should have full emergence by the end of the week." Vernon nodded, squinted at the field. "You using any pre-emerge herbicide?" "Amiben," Merle said. "Applied it right after planting. Should keep the foxtail down. And if it doesn't, I'll cultivate, same as you do with corn." Vernon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You really think this is the future, huh? Beans replacing corn." "Not replacing," Merle said, complimenting. "Rotation. It's how we're supposed to farm, Vernon. The way the land was designed." Vernon smiled, but there wasn't much warmth in it. "We'll see." The summer of 1968 was decent. Not perfect. There was a dry spell in July that had everyone worried, but the rains came back in early August, just when the soybeans were setting pods. Merle walked his fields every evening after supper, checking for insects, looking at pod development, pulling random plants to count nodes. He took notes in a spiral notebook, recording observations. August 4th, aphids present but not at threshold. Predator insects, lady beetles, active. No spray needed. Dorothy would sometimes walk with him. They'd stroll between the rows, not saying much, just listening to the rustle of leaves and the hum of cicadas in the evening heat. Once, she asked him if he was worried. "About what?" Merle said, "About being wrong. About all this." Merle thought about it. "I'd be worried if I hadn't done the work," he said. "But I did the work. Read the research. Talk to the agronomists. Looked at the economics, 6 ways from Sunday. If I'm wrong, it won't be because I didn't try to get it right." Dorothy slipped her hand into his. "That's all anyone can do." By late August, the bean plants were waist-high and heavy with pods. Merle had never seen a soybean crop look that good. The leaves were dark green, no sign of disease, and the pods were clustered thick along the stems. He started making plans for harvest. The International Harvester 403 combine he owned was a pull-type model, built in 1960, that he pulled with his Alice D19. It had a 10-foot grain platform that Merle had modified with a floating cutter bar to handle the low-growing soybeans. He'd also installed a set of retarder bars in the cylinder to reduce the rotor speed. Soybeans were more fragile than wheat or oats, and too much cylinder speed would crack the seed and lower the grade. Harvest started the second week of September. The Wayne variety came off first. Merle combined 30 acres in 2 days, and when he ran the first load to the elevator in Chenoa, the Streeter Junction elevator still didn't have adequate bean storage. The moisture was at 12%, and the test weight was 56 pounds per bushel. The elevator manager, a man named Larson, sampled the load and looked at Merle with something close to surprise. "You grew this?" Larson said. "I did." "Livingston County?" "That's right." Larson shook his head. "I haven't seen beans as clean in 5 years." "What did it yield?" 32 bushel. Larson whistled. 32. On new ground. That's well above average. Merle didn't smile, but he felt something loosen in his chest. Validation. Just a little. Enough to keep going. The Hawkeye came off next. 28 bushels per acre, a little lower than the Wayne, but still solid. The Amsoy 71 yielded 30 bushels. When Merle tallied up the final numbers in his ledger, total production, total revenue at $258 a bushel, minus seed and chemical costs. The profit margin was better than what he would have made on corn. Not wildly better, but better. And that was in the first year, before the rotation benefits kicked in. Here's what I want to know. Would you have had the nerve to do what Merle did? Converting a third of your acreage to a crop your neighbors thought was crazy? Be honest in the comments. The reaction in Streeter Junction was muted. A few people congratulated Merle. Most just shrugged and said things like, "Well, it was a good year for beans," or "Let's see how it goes next year." Vernon Heikkinen stopped by one evening in October, after Merle had finished combining the last field. They stood in the machine shed, looking at the 403 combine that Merle was greasing and prepping for storage. I heard you did all right, Vernon said. Can't complain, Merle replied. What are you planting there next year? Corn. All of it. That's the rotation. Vernon nodded slowly. You really think the corn's going to yield better after beans? It will, Merle said. I've read enough studies to know. Soil biology improves. Nitrogen's fixed. Structure's better. The corn will show it. And if it doesn't, then I'll adjust. That's farming, Vernon. Vernon kicked at a loose bolt on the shop floor. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Merle said, but it's not as complicated as people make it, either. You look at the data. You test it. You make adjustments. That's all I'm doing. Vernon left without saying much else. But Merle could tell something had shifted. The conversation wasn't hostile anymore. It was curious. The spring of 1969, Merle planted corn on 160 acres where he'd grown beans a year before. He used the same fertilizer program he always used, 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, broadcast in the spring and side-dressed at V6 stage. But he noticed something almost immediately. The corn emerged faster. The stands were more uniform. By June, when the crop was knee-high, it was already clear that this corn looked different than the corn on the rest of his farm. At harvest that fall, the difference was measurable. The corn following beans averaged 148 bushels per acre. The continuous corn on the other half of the farm, ground that hadn't been rotated, averaged 131, 17 bushels per acre. That was a rotation benefit. Right there in black and white in Merle's yield monitor data. Word got around. Not because Merle advertised it. He wasn't the type to brag, but because numbers like that don't stay secret in a small farming community. At the grain elevator, at the cafe, at church, people started asking questions. Not hostile questions anymore. Just questions. What variety of beans did you plant? How much did the seed cost? You think my ground would work for beans? Merle answered them all the same way. Patient. Factual. No preaching. Just here's what I did. Here's what happened. Here's what I learned. In 1970, Merle planted 160 acres of beans again. This time, he tried a new variety called Clark 63, which had better standability and resistance to Phytophthora root rot. The yield was 34 bushels per acre. Soybean prices had climbed a little, $2.65 by harvest, and Merle's profit per acre was even better than it had been in '68. A few neighbors started experimenting. Vernon Heikkinen planted 40 acres of beans in 1970. Another farmer, a younger guy named Dale Morrow who farmed a quarter section east of town, put in 60 acres. They both came to Merle for advice. What planter settings to use, what herbicides worked best, how to set the combine. Merle helped them. He didn't see any reason not to. There was enough land and enough market for everyone, but most of the county was still skeptical. Soybeans were fine for Merle Gustafson, people said, but that didn't mean they were right for everyone. Corn was still king. Corn was still safe. Then 1972 happened. Now, if you know anything about agricultural history, you know that 1972 was the year everything changed. The Soviet Union had a catastrophic wheat harvest. Drought and mismanagement devastated their production, and in July, the U.S. government negotiated a deal to sell the Soviets massive quantities of grain. Not just wheat, soybeans, too. The Soviets needed protein for their livestock operations, and American soybeans were suddenly in demand like never before. By October 1972, soybean prices had climbed from $2.60 to $3.20. By the spring of 1973, they were pushing $4 a bushel. Corn prices rose, too. The whole grain complex was on fire, but soybeans were the star. Suddenly, every farmer in Livingston County was doing the math. 40 bushels of beans at $4 a bushel was $160 gross income per acre. Even factoring in costs, that was better than corn. A lot better. The phone started ringing at Merle's house. Neighbors who'd ignored him in '68 were calling to ask questions. The implement dealer in Pontiac couldn't keep soybean planters in stock. The seed companies were scrambling to meet demand. At the elevator in Streeter Junction, which had finally built a dedicated bean storage annex, The manager told Merle they were expecting double the volume for the 73 harvest. Spring of 1973, Merle was in his shop, working on his planter, when Vernon Heikkinen pulled in the driveway. Vernon got out his truck and walked over, hands in his pockets. "Got a minute?" Vernon asked. "Always," Merle said. Vernon was quiet for a moment, looking at the planter. Then he said, "I'm planting 200 acres of beans this year." Merle nodded. "That's a good decision." "I should have done it 5 years ago," Vernon said. "When you did." Merle wiped his hands on a rag. "You're doing it now. That's what matters." "I was wrong," Vernon said. "I thought you were crazy. I thought you were risking everything for no good reason. But you knew. You saw it coming." "I didn't see the Russian grain deal coming," Merle said. "Nobody did. I just knew the agronomy made sense. The rotation made sense. The economics were solid even before prices jumped. That's all I was betting on." Vernon shook his head. "You're too modest, Merle. What you did, planting 160 acres in 68, when everyone said you were nuts, that took guts. I didn't have it. Most of us didn't." Merle didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Vernon turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing," he said. "Thank you for not being smug about it, for helping guys like me when we finally came around. You could have rubbed it in. You didn't." "No point in that," Merle said. That spring, Merle planted the same rotation he'd been running since 1968. Corn on the ground that had been in beans. Beans on the ground that had been in corn. Steady, predictable, profitable. He didn't increase his bean acres just because prices were high. He didn't chase the market. He stuck to the plan. By May, half the county was planting soybeans. Fields that had been in continuous corn for 30 years were suddenly striped with the lighter green of emerging soybean plants. The implement dealer had to order extra soybean equipment. The elevator had to hire another crew to handle the projected volume. The county extension agent, a young agronomist named Tom Reeves, who'd only been in the job 2 years, started holding soybean production meetings at the VFW Hall in Pontiac. 50 farmers showed up to the first one. At one of those meetings, someone asked Tom about rotation benefits and nitrogen savings. Tom launched into an explanation, citing university research and field trial data. Then someone in the back, Merle didn't see who, said, "Hell, Tom, Merle Gustafson's been telling us this for 5 years. We just didn't listen." The room got quiet. A few people turned to look at Merle, who was sitting near the door. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod. After the meeting, Tom Reeves found Merle in the parking lot. "I heard you were one of the early adopters," Tom said. "Started in 68? "That's right. What made you do it?" Tom asked. "When no one else was?" Merle thought about it. "I read the reports," he said finally, "from the university, from USDA. The data was there. I just trusted it." Tom smiled. "Most farmers don't trust research. They trust their neighbors." "I know," Merle said, "but sometimes you have to trust the data first. Neighbors come around eventually." The 1973 growing season was one of the best on record. Warm, wet spring, timely rains through July. A long, mild fall that let the beans mature slowly and fill completely. Merle's yields hit 38 bushels per acre. At $4 a bushel, that was $152 gross per acre. Even after costs, he cleared $90 profit per acre on his bean ground. The corn did well, too, 155 bushels following beans, which was 10 bushels above the county average. At harvest, the elevator in Streeter Junction was overwhelmed. Trucks lined up for half a mile, waiting to unload. Merle hauled most of his crop to Cheno and Fairbury, where the lines were shorter. But even there, the volume was staggering. One afternoon, while Merle was waiting in line at the Cheno elevator, he struck up a conversation with a farmer from the next township over. The guy was maybe 60, had been farming his whole life. "You're Gustafson, aren't you?" the man said. "That's right. I heard about you. Started planting beans back when everyone thought it was crazy." Merle shrugged. "I wouldn't say crazy. just different. "Well, it paid off," the man said. "You must feel pretty good right now." Merle considered that. Did he feel good? He felt satisfied, not smug, not vindicated in any loud or showy way. Just satisfied that the work had paid off, that the data had been right, that trusting the research and doing the math and sticking to the plan had worked. "It feels good to be farming right," Merle said. That's all. By the mid-'70s, soybeans were everywhere in Livingston County. The acreage had tripled. The elevator had expanded twice. The implement dealers were selling more bean equipment than corn equipment. And the old guys, the ones who'd said beans would never work, that corn was king forever. Most of them had retired or sold out. The next generation was farming differently. Merle kept doing what he'd always done. Rotation. Corn and beans. Steady. He didn't expand his acreage. Didn't buy more land. Didn't leverage himself into debt, chasing the market. He farmed 400 acres, same as he had in 1968, and he farmed them well. One Sunday after church in the fall of 1975, Emil Thorson, the old deacon who'd warned Merle about beans back in '68, pulled him aside. Emil was in his 80s by then, shrunken and slow-moving, but his mind was still sharp. "You remember what I told you?" Emil said. "About beans being a supplement crop?" "I remember," Merle said. "I was wrong." Emil said. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to say it. But I was wrong. You saw something I didn't." Merle smiled. "You weren't wrong, Emil. Beans were a supplement crop. Back then. But things change. The research changes. The markets change. You have to change with them." "Still," Emil said, "it took nerve to do what you did." "Or stubbornness," Merle said. Emil laughed. It was a dry, crackling sound. Maybe a little of both. Now, here's the thing about stories like this. They're not really about soybeans. They're about the willingness to look at data instead of tradition, to trust research over rumor, to endure ridicule from people you respect because you believe you're right. Merle Gustafson didn't invent soybean farming. He didn't discover anything the university agronomists hadn't already published. He just had the guts to apply it when no one else would. And the thing is, he didn't do it to prove anyone wrong. He did it because the math made sense, because the agronomy was sound, because rotating crops was how you were supposed to farm if you cared about the land long term. The fact that he turned out to be right, that soybeans became a major cash crop, that the market exploded in the '70s, that half the county ended up copying him, all of that was secondary. Merle would have done it even if prices had stayed flat, because it was the right way to farm. That's the lesson, if there is one. Not that you should chase trends or gamble on markets, but that you should trust good data, even when it's unpopular. That you should be willing to be the first one to try something if the fundamentals are sound, and that you should do it quietly without fanfare, knowing that if you're right, the neighbors will figure out eventually. According to Illinois Department of Agriculture records, soybean acreage in the state went from just over 3 million acres in 1968 to more than 8 million acres by 1980. The shift transformed the agricultural economy of the state, made Illinois one of the top soybean producers in the nation, created an entire industry around processing, transportation, and export. And it started with individual farmers making individual decisions, often in the face of skepticism and doubt. Merle Gustafson farmed until 1987, when he retired and turned the operation over to his oldest son, who'd studied agricultural economics at the University of Illinois and had come back to farm. The son kept the rotation, corn and beans, beans and corn, and expanded it to 600 acres. Today, Merle's grandson farms 1,200 acres in Livingston County, still rotating, still following the principles Merle applied back in 1968. Merle passed away in 2003 at the age of 77. His obituary in the Pontiac Daily Leader mentioned that he'd been a pioneer in soybean production in the county, one of the first to plant significant acreage back when it was considered experimental. But Merle never thought of himself that way. He thought of himself as a farmer who read the research and trusted the data. That's all. Nothing fancy. Nothing heroic. just a man who did the work, and let the results speak for themselves. If you want more stories about the farmers who saw what was coming before everyone else, subscribe. These are the decisions that changed American agriculture, one stubborn man at a time. And if this reminds you of someone in your own family, a father or grandfather who made a call that everyone questioned but turned out to be right, leave their name in the comments. These stories matter. They're worth remembering.